Hello and welcome to the Against the Stream podcast, the weekly communist view of the world where we analyze events that are going on a world scale from a Marxist and communist perspective. My name is Hamid Alizadeh and I'm here with Fred Weston today, and we have a whole series of very interesting topics to discuss with you. First of all, we'll be discussing the unraveling and the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria. We'll be discussing the question of the Kurdish uh, enclave of Rojava, also in Syria. Then we'll be discussing the latest developments in the Ukraine. And at the end, we will finish with the discussion on Luigi Mangione, the person who allegedly assassinated the CEO of United Health last week. So there's enough to get on with there. Now, Fred, I thought we should start with Syria because a lot has happened in the past 2 weeks that no one, I would say, before that would have guessed could have happened. We saw an offensive starting from the northwestern province of Idlib, led by a group of Islamist militias organized around what's called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They started an offensive towards the city of Aleppo, which is the main industrial city of Syria. And within 3 days, the city of Aleppo fell. Then the campaign continued south from Idlib towards the city of Hama. And again, within a very brief period of time, the city of Hama fell. And after that, it seemed like the Syrian state just melted away. And within 11 days, on Sunday, you saw the total collapse of the Syrian regime. Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, and his wife and family fled to Russia. And Hayat Tahrir al-Sham marched into Damascus basically unopposed. Meanwhile, other militias took control of other areas. Private militias or militias of different warlords took over their own areas in different parts of the country. In Suwaida in the south, the Druze militias took over that whole area. Militias who were under the protection of the American forces in Al-Tanaf in the south, again, marched up and took Palmyra in the center of the country. You had ISIS groups that have been festering in the desert, in the barren deserts of Syria, again, becoming more bold, reportedly taking larger areas. You had the Syrian National Army, which is a group of proxies directly controlled by Turkey, who attacked the Kurdish areas in the north and Manbij, and we'll talk about that. And also, you saw the Israel, which has come on into the scene and taken a chunk of the Golan Heights. They say that they're building a buffer zone, but the Golan Heights was supposed to be their buffer zone. So now they're making a buffer zone for the buffer zone, I guess. But before we go into analyzing what is actually happening here, what all of this means, I think we should just take a moment and consider this. We talked about last week that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is an Islamist organization which has been throughout its history linked to Al-Qaeda. It shares the same ideology as Al-Qaeda. It has a tactical difference with Al-Qaeda in that it believes that maintaining a national outlook formally will make it more palatable to Western powers to receive money, funds, and support in all sorts of ways. And it is a proscribed organization in Britain. In fact, British law says that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and others, this is quote, should be treated as alternative names for Al-Qaeda. This is British law itself, right? And nevertheless, you have actually British politicians talking about delisting Al-Qaeda from the terror list. Former MI6 chief Sir John Soros has called on the UK to reassess its prescription of the HTS. There was I actually I noted it down here, but I forgot the name. There was a British peer who has also been in the intelligence community, again, who says that that they should be taken off the list. Keir Starmer has considered this, although for now he says we should wait and see. But I mean, look at the hypocrisy compared to Gaza, compared to Hamas, compared to Lebanon, compared to anyone who violates the interests of American imperialism and Western imperialism and who's immediately deemed a terrorist, and anyone who objects to any of the things that the American imperialists really do are branded more or less with them as imperialists, at least implied. And yet these guys, who don't hide the fact that they're closely linked to Al-Qaeda ideologically, are treated with kid gloves like this. What do you make of that?
Well, it brings out the utter hypocrisy of the imperialist powers, these so-called Western democracies. They're not defending democracy or the rights of any people. They defend their interests as imperialist powers. And therefore, what today is a terrorist, tomorrow becomes a rebel, and vice versa.
The moderate rebels.
Yeah, if it's useful to them, change the tag. These are classed as terrorist organizations, but nobody refers to them like that. They refer to them as rebels. The reason for that is to give them this aura, this image of people who are fighting for the liberation of their country, which is not. It does not correspond to the real position on the ground. The leader of this, the HTS, he's down in history as having welcomed the attack on the Twin Towers in New York, all those, over 20 years ago. Now, somebody, imagine then going to the American people and saying, oh, this guy, he supports the attack on the Twin Towers, but he's our hero now. It highlights the hypocrisy of the people at the top. What imperialism does in every region, it looks for who it can lean on to carry out its own interests. And that means that sometimes what was yesterday's enemy can become your friend. What has not changed are the interests of the imperialist powers in the region. Now, if you look at referring to the collapse of the regime, the conditions which the Syrian people have suffered these past few years, they've got worse and worse as time has gone on. I read one figure, something like close to 70% of the population are classed as living in poverty. Interestingly, one detail, more than half of those poor live in just 3 areas: Aleppo, Hama, and Deir ez-Zor. So the conditions faced by a lot of ordinary people in a place like Aleppo or Hama were desperate economic, social conditions. And on top of that, you have a regime which had become utterly parasitic, right to the very top of the regime, starting with Assad himself, but also his cronies. There are people who had become rich under Assad by plundering what used to be the publicly owned properties. Telecommunications and other companies were privatized to the friends of Assad, basically, making billions. There's an individual, a guy called Makrouf. I think he didn't do too well in this attack, by what I've heard, the latest information I saw. But a family that became ultra rich at the expense of ordinary people, but basically plundering the wealth of the country. On top of that, you then have the civil war. For example, oil, which used to be a major source of income for the regime. The regime lost control of oil production. And by the way, a significant amount of it is controlled directly by the United States and with the Kurds in the northeast. But having lost the sources of income they used to have in the past, having privatized and brought to power a bunch of crony capitalists, it's not surprising that at a certain point, what looked like from the outside looked like a powerful regime. I mean, they seemed to have stabilized the situation with the help of the Russians, the Iranians. They had fought back against many of the different groups that arose after 2011, and they seemed to be what on the surface looked like a relatively stable situation. But you see, sometimes what you see from the outside doesn't tell you what's going on the inside. The outer shell remains, but it's like, a nice piece of furniture that's riddled with woodworm, and they've eaten every little bit of what was inside. But unless you touch it from a distance, it still looks like a table.
Yeah.
You touch it and it crumbles to dust.
Yep.
What happened here? Yeah.
No, I mean, I completely agree. And I have, I think I sent this to you as well yesterday. There's a YouTuber who claims to be in touch with an officer, a high-ranking officer in the Syrian army, in the 4th Corps, which is one of the better parts of the Syrian army. And he was stationed in Aleppo, and he said that a garrison of 10,000 men just melted away at the sign of these jihadis attacking. And then he gave a little bit of a background. He said, look, he says, the professionalism and logistics of these fighters is unprecedented. Of course, they've been supported by Turkey and trained up, armed, equipped. He says, our problems were one of jamming of our radio communications. That, I think, is a very basic an excuse, basically, because every army tries to jam each other, and that doesn't mean that they collapse. But then he comes and says, 2, the treason by some senior officers. Now that's an important one, because we've heard a lot of reports, also during the Civil War, but it would have become worse now, of senior officers just seeing the army as a ways of enriching themselves. And we'll get back to that. And making deals with the jihadis at key situations. And of course, with Hezbollah and Russian troops being distracted elsewhere, not being at the forefront, these corrupt officers were the first line of defense. And it would have been very easy for them to make a deal with the opposing side. Then he says, this is the more important one in my opinion. Well, all of these kind of come together. So, and 3, the lack of willingness of our troops to fight, which you can understand. Al-Nusra, that's what they call Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, because that's the original name of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And everyone knows that this is just Al-Nusra in a rebranded form. It says, Al-Nusra, which is, Al-Nusra gets paid $1,500 a month. Our troops are paid $50 a month. Yes. So you can only imagine the spirit of our soldiers. Our soldiers wear sneakers, Adidas and Nike. Their soldiers wear full army uniform. Their soldiers look like regular forces. We look like the militia. And I think that says, I think actually a lot is concentrated in this little point, because the officer corps of the Syrian army was completely rotted away. You had a situation, this goes way back to the time of Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father actually, who organized the army not so much as a force to defend itself, to defend the country, but as a force that could not overthrow Hafez. Hafez himself came to power on the basis of a coup. There's a tradition of coups in Syria. And so the army, he made sure to defang the army, so to say, so they couldn't act against him. That meant that the army was split up in different parts, each part of them given as gifts of loyalty to kingpins and gangsters and warlords in different areas. And they used it as their private armies for their own enrichment. We saw this in the Syrian civil war. You had lots of times where the officers would get arms and food, and then they would sell it to the jihadis on the other side. And then obviously their soldiers didn't want to fight. Obviously no soldier want to fight with such officers, which meant that the Syrian army itself was not the main one fighting the fights in Syria. The Russians, when they came, set up their own 5th Corps, which was a professional army, well paid and well equipped, well fed. The the normal Syrian conscript would not get food. They were treated like slaves by their officers, in fact, personal slaves. Then you had the Iranian militias and Hezbollah again paying people to set up their own militias, and that also meant that actually the few loyal and disciplined elements that existed within the Syrian army began to they were dragged out of the system, so to say. Now, as you explained, you had the effect of the war being extreme economic dislocation, the sanctions by the Americans, and all of these things, meaning that the economy completely collapsed in the past 3 years. The lira, the Syrian currency, devalued by 90%, which meant that you had a desperate situation. And in this situation, all of this corruption, all of this oppression, all of it just became even worse. And you saw officers and warlords who controlled this or that part of the army just using it. Literally, they would go in sometimes, they go into a building, rip it all, go out and sell it. That's what they made their money on. And then they would set up checkpoints and take bribes. In fact, conscript soldiers were so badly treated that people would give them bribes out of sympathy, not even as a as a way of saving themselves. Because and you've seen reports where conscript soldiers were taken hostage by HTS, and then they got the first warm meal that they've had for years. I saw a figure. This is a report from last October. Sorry, it was made last October, but it's a figure of cost of living in Syria. In 2014, the cost of living and the minimum salary was approximately the same, around 13,000 Syrian liras. In September 2022, the cost of living for an individual to live was about 3.5 million lira. The minimum wage was 92,000. Now that creates a situation that you explained, with more than 60% of the population say that their main concern is getting food. And meanwhile, what you have is the pillars of the state just busy enriching themselves, just eating, gobbling up all, basically taking the silverware while the house is burning down. And then you have a situation where someone knocks on the door and the house collapses, actually. And I think also there's another element to add, which we discussed earlier today, that I think once Aleppo had fallen the way it did, it also seems like the tops of the regime themselves were completely demoralized. Assad did not put up any fight. He didn't even call, because even though a lot of people are happy to see Assad go, most of them do not trust these Islamists, these jihadis. He did not make any attempt to call for mobilization, call for a defense. He didn't make any statements. I think he was just demoralized. He was completely isolated, hated by everyone, even the Alawites, which were normally given preferential treatment. That's the sect that Assad is from, and the Christians and so on. Even those parts of the population which were previously had a slightly more privileged position had turned their backs to him. And I think he had an element of personal demoralization. In the past years, there's been lots of pressure on Assad. The Gulf states have been trying to negotiate with him to make a deal with the Americans, to lift sanctions in exchange for kicking the Iranians out. Erdogan in Turkey has been trying to make a deal with him. The Russians have been pushing him to make a deal with Turkey, which would mean giving away a lot of power. And meanwhile, the Iranians wanted him not to do anything against them, and they controlled a big part of the army and the militias running society and so on. And so it seems to me that he became very intransigent in his position, refused for example, to negotiate with Erdogan, which is why Erdogan eventually gave the green light for this. And caught in between all of these pressures after 12 years of civil war, where he was carrying in his own eyes the full responsibility of the country, there must have been an element of demoralization, because otherwise the way that this happened couldn't have happened, as we saw it.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, just before I go into that, I just found a figure for inflation this past year. 93% inflation on top of all the other, combined with government subsidy cuts. That's an interesting one. That's something that they're doing in many countries, which hits the poorest people, obviously. But what has happened here is the base of support for the regime has been undermined. There was a degree. So after the revolution of 2011, and then very quickly, the revolutionary elements were basically snuffed out, and when it became a civil war with reaction on both sides, the prospect back then of some of these wilder, you could say, these extreme Islamist jihadist groups coming to take over cities like Damascus actually provided a base for Assad, in the sense that although Assad is what he is, sometimes, better the devil you know than the one you don't. We don't know how bad these guys could be. And there was an element, clearly, of fear. They don't want to be governed by these people of Damascus. And
this was a time when Islamic State was cutting people's head off. And
that's right. They were genuinely terrified.
And by the way, HTS has carried out similar atrocities.
Yes. Even now, they're carrying out summary executions, according to some sources. But that is, there's that element of the fear of what this could be, but also a memory of what the regime had been in the past. We mustn't forget that Syria, in the past, when it had a essentially planned economy, public ownership of most of the economy, actually granted a reasonable existence to most people, healthcare, social welfare, etc. Plus, of course, the oil revenues. That memory was connected to the old regime going back to the 60s. But you see, time works away slowly, eating away at a regime like this. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the general worldwide swing towards privatization, the Assad regime embarked on a policy of, I think they called it the social market economy, very similar to what the Chinese bureaucracy was saying, i.e., break down all the old state-run industries, privatize them, hand them over. And with this has come an extreme degree of corruption amongst this layer. Now, the Assad regime was able to survive, partially, obviously, with the support of Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, some of the best fighters. Some of these people, Hezbollah, were pulled out, as we know. This actually revealed the weakness of the Syrian army. But you see, even if the wages of the soldiers are low, if an army feels that it's fighting for a regime that's worth fighting for, they'd be prepared to make sacrifices. Imagine you're just an ordinary Syrian soldier. You're fighting to defend your family, your mother, your sister, your brother, your father, whatever, your children. You're defending your neighbor, defending the reasonably civilized existence that they have. And if you believe in that the regime is worth fighting for, soldiers are prepared to fight and make a sacrifice. It's clear what's happened here is the inner degeneration of the regime, the corruption, the rottenness of the regime affected wide layers of the population who had lost that support, had lost that confidence. In a certain sense, it's like, how bad can it get? Can it get any worse than this? And at that point, anybody comes and gives a bit of a push, and of course, behind that push is Turkey, who clearly has provided all this advanced technology that these militia, the HTS has. If I don't have these in my ears, I won't hear you, Hamid. Sorry. At a certain point, anybody that comes knocking, as you say, can bring the whole thing down. What we've had here is de facto, the state has collapsed.
Yeah.
The armed bodies of men, when we go back to the basic idea of Marxism, that it's the armed bodies of men in defense of certain property relations, obviously, that has collapsed. Now, when the centralized armed bodies of men, i.e., the Syrian army, the state, collapses, other armed bodies of men will step in. And what we have here is Syria now de facto breaking up. It had already broken up, but now you can see it. You know, you have the armed Kurds in the northeast, together with several hundred US troops on the ground. Then you have this HTS marching in from the north of Aleppo, backed by Turkey, and there are Turkish troops on the ground. And then you have the Druzes. You have the country, in effect, Syria doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
The historical Syria within the internationally recognized borders don't exist anymore. What you have is regional groups in power. But something else I think we should highlight is the forces behind that have coalesced to form this HTS, this new formation, as they call it, is not a unified body with one view. It's quite clear to me that the leader of HTS has been drilled by the imperialists, by the Turks. You got to clean up your image.
Yep.
There's a meme going around of a barber dressed up as Uncle Sam, cleaning him up, sort of trimming his beard, helped by an Israeli agent, i.e., to make him presentable, basically, that this is somebody that we can support. But the forces coalesced around him. They're not one unified bloc with one view. For example, you notice that immediately as they were marching forward, they were making statements about Israel. You know, we love Israel. We have no problem with Israel. We are friends of Israel. All this kind of thing. Well, if they were so friendly to Israel, you'd think that Netanyahu would be happy for these people to take over and inherit all the weaponry of that Assad left behind. You know, the army, the weapons, the tanks, the planes, the military bases. Instead, Israel has proceeded to bomb all of this to pieces.
Yes.
Surely Netanyahu should be leaving this intact for this friend of Israel called the HTS. Instead, they clearly understand that within this outfit there are elements of the extreme jihadist Islamic types who are not. The reports I've been reading, they're not too happy with these statements about being friends of Israel. So even this new power, which has risen in Damascus, is no guarantee of a stable government which can govern Syria and put it back on its feet and reestablish some kind of a reasonable existence for its people.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of videos of HTS fighters having an ISIS Islamic State emblem on their shoulders, and obviously this is a group that comes from Al-Qaeda. It has an Al-Qaeda ideology. It's cleaned up its act, or on the surface, is trying to present itself in a more presentable manner, but in order to get support. But as you say, there's a logic to these things. Taliban has experienced that even though they want to present themselves in a certain way, there are more radical elements, and they are being drawn by ISIS in Afghanistan. Now, all of this is obviously also related to another thing, which is the dead end of capitalism. If anything, if this is a proof of anything, that's it. That is it, because the Syrian, in Syria, as you said, you had a revolution in 2011. That revolution, we've analyzed this, and we'll get back to this another time, but that revolution made a series of mistakes, amongst which was thinking that it could appeal to the West for support against the Assad regime. That sealed its fate, because the majority of Syrians, in particular the working class in the cities, realized what Western intervention meant. Now, from there, this movement became a civil war. And from there, it became hijacked. The movement was hijacked by the West with the support of Assad, who released all the Islamists, but was hijacked by the West and turned into an Islamist insurgency against the Assad regime. Now, that changed the whole character of it, because what you really had then was a struggle against foreign intervention, against imperialist intervention inside of Syria. And the majority of people rallied behind the regime. As you said, one, they were opposed to the US imperialism and their allies, the Gulf states, Turkey, and all of these people interfering in Syria. And two, they were against ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and all of these, the Islamists. However, here we have actually a situation where the national bourgeoisie won against imperialism. You can say the Western imperialism was defeated. It's true that Iran helped and Russia helped, but in reality, what happened was that the Western intervention was defeated. But then a lot of people see. I talked with our comrades, our Syrian comrades, on Sunday, and what this comrade was saying was, people are looking back and thinking, why did we do all this fight? What did we do all this fighting for? Our lives, living standards has collapsed. Rule is completely arbitrary. The Assad, and in every office there's a picture of Assad and Bashar and Assad in like beautiful designer clothes and gold chains and in their palaces. And then you have people middle class people who can't cook because they can't afford gas. You get one gas canister per 3 months that you can use for a couple of meals, and that's it. And that situation is not going to go away. And that's going to add to the instability. The extreme poverty and destitution is going to add to this. But I think also it reveals the situation in the Middle East, because it's true that at this point in time, power fell into the hands of these reactionaries by accident, in a way, not by design. No one could have guessed that this is how things would go around. But that is the condition that exists everywhere. Anger, demoralization with all of the existing regimes. This is not just, this is not just Syria. Jordan is the same thing. Iraq is the same thing. We've seen movements in Lebanon. The Gulf states, here are kingdoms with the immense riches and large parts of the population living in poverty. Some of them being oppressed Shias who are also oppressed, religiously. That is a warning sign to where things are going. And the economic situation, you can have as many rulers as you want and with as many guises and with as many ideologies as you wish. But if they can't feed you, then they cannot stabilize the situation. And that's what this really, in my opinion, means in terms of where the Middle East is moving, of extreme unrest and instability, war and civil war, but also in that midst, the potential for revolutionary developments.
That's right. This thing about democracy, more than once I've seen in history references to what does democracy mean for me? I'm a poor person in an underdeveloped country. And I remember this in Nigeria when the military regime was collapsing, and people would say, democracy? They were quoted, someone saying, is that something you can eat?
Yeah, how does that taste?
Does it give me food? Does it put food on my table? And I was looking back at this article I wrote in 2013, which was analyzing the nature of the regime. And one of the comments there was about the revolution, which in the early days of 2011, there was a genuine movement. If you remember, the slogan of those young people was, we are all Syrians. We are all Syrians, i.e., we're not going to let you guys use the ethnic question to divide us. And yet that's exactly what has happened. The country is being divided up. But again, the comment I remember writing in that comment was that it calls for democracy. But democracy, if it comes without a solution to people's social and economic problems, means very little to ordinary people. Democracy is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself, i.e., democratic right to struggle for a decent wage, for decent housing, for decent living. If it doesn't mean that, what does it mean to me? Then you can have all kinds of political forces coming in, including these Islamic fundamentalists, who promise another road to a good life, and they can have an effect on a certain section of the population. So the 2011 revolution gave a small glimpse of what would be possible, but it also highlighted something else. That revolution didn't have a party that could unite the working class across the whole of Syria. It didn't have a program that could solve the problems. Democracy also is often accompanied by privatization and the
Yes.
market economy. Well, the
Which is
program
what
should have-
Assad was doing, and which ultimately caused that revolution to begin with.
Exactly. The demand of the revolution should have actually been renationalize what has been privatized, but under
Yes.
the control of the working class. I want to talk about democracy, add an adjective to it. Workers' democracy.
Yeah.
The workers in power, the workers who control. Here's a country which was rich in oil resources. And
Agricultural land.
And everything. A country potentially wealthy, which could have given all its people a reasonable standard of living, but in the hands first of a state bureaucracy, then transformed into individual capitalists like the Makroufs and others, who were basically taking the cream off the top, for themselves and pocketing it, no doubt stashing it away in safe places like Switzerland, London, or New York. Usually when these regimes collapse, the people at the top have prepared a place for themselves to run off to, where they can live in luxury with the wealth they've creamed off, and leaving behind the people to suffer the consequences of their policies. But I'm telling you, what the collapse of this regime also highlights is actually how easily a seemingly strong regime backed up by mighty powers can collapse very quickly. What it means is that there's a long process has been taking place of slow rotting away from the inside, and then the conditions are ripe for anybody to step in. Now the question is, who steps in? Imagine if it had been an organized party of the working class with a clear program and policy. It could have become a big force in Damascus in these conditions, but there is no such force. And politics, when there's a vacuum, something fills it. And this time it's being filled by these people. But I'm just imagining, when I saw these events unfolding, I thought, if I was the king of Jordan sitting next door, watching all this and seeing this regime collapse just like that. I tell you, if you look closely at the Jordanian regime, I think, they haven't had a civil war. It's true. There's a lot of things, but
anger is there.
Unemployment has grown, inflation, massive austerity program, constant cut in public spent, the subsidies, the state subsidies, which also Assad was doing, combined with a clear indication that the regime is completely out of sync with its own people. That little detail when the Iranian missiles came over and the regime fired at them, they were seen as collaborating with Israel and the US. And there was genuine anger amongst thousands and thousands of young people in Jordan. So it's a regime which could go. What we're looking at is extremely fragile regimes that could be toppled quite easily if somebody takes the initiative. Now, 2011 showed that an all sort of North African, Middle Eastern movement of Arab and other peoples in that region could take place more or less at the same time. It started with one country and it spread to one after another. We know how it ended, but that's not going to be the last time we see it. The conditions are being prepared for movements like this across this region. That's why the Saudis, they're expressing concern about the situation. They're all very worried about what is happening.
And actually, just to reiterate your point, actually, we have the next segment that we were planning is connected to this, which is the situation in the Kurdish areas. Because, and I think there are important lessons here, although it's a slight detour. Because just to start with, we just saw how the West and the British government, British ruling class, is seriously considering delisting an Al-Qaeda organization from the terrorist list.
Mm-hmm.
But the Kurdish PKK organization, they don't have any intentions of taking you off the list. In fact, on the day that this offensive started, 6 people were arrested and charged with being members of a terrorist organization in London. And there's been protests in London. There's been clashes between the police and the Kurdish community. And I think that that has really highlighted the utter hypocrisy of the West, the way that they treat the Kurds, because obviously the Kurdish organizations in Syria play a very important role. Played a very important role in the Syrian civil war. The organization, the YPG, the organization that controls the northeastern part of Syria, which is a sister organization of the Kurdish PKK, is a leftist organization, an ex-communist, you can say ex-Stalinist organization with very leftist ideas, talking about the installation, the destruction of the old capitalist state, the introduction of some sort of a council rule. And what happened was that they were, in fact, the West leaned on these as the most important allies in their struggle against Islamic State. Now, in the last few weeks, we've seen how true the West is to these brave fighters that played such an important role in defeating Islamic State. In the north, in Tal Rifat, the Kurdish areas were overrun by HTS and Kurdish and Turkish-supported militias. Sheikh Maksud, which was a neighborhood in Aleppo, again, the same thing. They were ethnically cleansed. All of the hundreds of thousands of Kurds or tens of thousands of Kurds were pushed out of those areas. That's obviously after, in 2018, where supported by the British government and Boris Johnson, the whole province of Afrin in the northwest was cleansed again. Hundreds of thousands of Kurds were driven out of their homelands. And now you had the situation of the city of Manbij on the western bank of the Euphrates River, which was held by the Kurdish SDF forces, by the same authority that controls northeastern Syria, where the Americans gave an ultimatum to the Kurdish forces saying, either you withdraw from Manbij and give it to Turkish proxies, or we will stop our armed support in terms of arms, weapon support for you, i.e. we will leave you undefended, unprotected in the face of Turkey, who has made it clear for a long time that they want the Kurds away from their border. They do not want an independent Kurdish enclave anywhere near their border, lest they would give some ideas to the oppressed Kurdish minority in Turkey. Now, here you have the whole, once again, the true nature of Western imperialism at full display. That on the one hand, they talk about the defenders of the peoples and defenders of democracy and human rights, and then they go and try to delist an Islamist jihadi terrorist organization, while they increase the pressure on a leftist organization, which is clearly the leading body of the Kurdish national liberation struggle against all of the imperialisms of the region. Now, you talked about, if there was a force that could appeal to all of to across sectarian boundaries. I think at one point, the Kurdish forces could have been that force. In fact, when they in the 2011 revolution, the Assad state collapsed in those areas, and the PKK fighters, the Kurdish fighters, essentially took over and started running society for the first time outside of the oppressive rule of the Assad regime. And at the same time, you had a massive ferment all over the Middle East. These were seen as the most radical elements. And over the years, they expanded their influence. In Turkey, they became their legal party, the HTS, became one of the biggest parties by 11 or 13%, was it, in one election, and with a huge amount of people beyond that looking towards them. looking to see how they would act. In the southeast of Turkey, they controlled all of the main cities. They had full political backing. They got 70, 80, 90% of the vote in those areas. They controlled Mount Shingal in northern Iraq and all of the mountain ranges towards the Iranian border, which means that they essentially controlled the strip from almost from the Mediterranean all the way to the Iranian border, bordering Turkey. And they were known as the most determined and non-sectarian fighters, the most progressive fighters against IS, Islamic State. They were famous for their leftist traditions, their leftist ideas, the idea of their anti-capitalism, in essence. And they could have actually gained a foothold. However, I would say that the tragedy that we have today, which is happening, is that they are completely surrounded now by all sides, and that boils down to, in particular, one mistake, which was to ally themselves with American imperialism.
Yes.
Now, that was obviously from a point of view of necessity. They were under attack by Turkey and other forces. However, they did have mass support amongst millions of people. And if they had made an appeal on a class basis rather than a nationalist basis, they would have gained an echo. That was clear. The working class in Turkey, they controlled the main trade unions in Turkey. The working class in Turkey was looking towards them, a big chunk of them. The youth in Turkey was Iranian youth. And that at that time, there was ferment everywhere, as you remember. And yet what they did was that they tied their fate to the interests of US imperialism, the most reactionary power on the planet, which is also the most hated power in the Middle East. If there's anyone that's hated, it's the US. Every nation has been severely oppressed and has severe scars from the interventions of US imperialism. And doing that undermined their authority, undermined their appeal, essentially.
Yes.
And then they went further. They negotiated with Assad regime. They negotiated with they made alliances with these Arabic tribes, reactionary Arabic tribes in the desert, in the south, in the east of the country. They could have done what the HTS did if they had built a class-based organization across Syria into the main cities, building cells, building organizations, arming, if necessary, building armed detachments. They already have an army of more than 100,000. And they could have done what the HTS did. And they would have that could have changed everything. That could have changed everything. And unfortunately, now we have a situation where they're at the mercy of the Americans. And Donald Trump has made it clear that he doesn't see them. Of course, he doesn't. He doesn't see them as important to his interests or to the interests of US imperialism. He doesn't want to have a fight with Erdogan over that. It's going to become, they're probably, I mean, we'll see how things will develop, but they're just a bargaining chip that's passed around by different imperialist powers. And in the process, the Kurdish people will suffer a lot.
Yes. Well, you see, I remember the Kurds being referred to as the biggest nation without its own state. The Kurds are spread across Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran. If you actually had a geographic division, it would be a sizable country. And yet it's broken up. This is a consequence clearly of the imperialists in the past who have cut through the living body of peoples, split them up, driven borders through them, divided them as part of their way of dominating these peoples, which they've done in the Middle East. Now, what's happening to them now? I mean, the Kurds, those north of Aleppo, there's still a small enclave there. The latest I saw was that these nice jihadis are creating a safe corridor, i.e. get out, and they are being forced out, what's left, because Erdogan wants that border cleared of Kurds, and he wants control of that border, and the Turks are going to stay there also as a present for a significant period. And as you said, others have also been pushed out. The Americans are collaborating with Erdogan on this question, in the sense of, okay, the Kurds get out of here. We'll keep our influence in the northeast. By the way, we'll keep our troops here, control over the oil and the region. But you see, there was a moment, as you said, Rojava was seen as this kind of shining light in the Middle East. And if you look at the stories, the interviews, the videos, there was a period in which they had that, the women fighters, the progressive nature of the regime, the councils, etc., in the northeast. But the question is this: they limited their perspective to the narrow confines of the Kurdish territory of Syria. They stayed within that. Now, I remember the leaders of the Kurds in Iraq across the border, nowhere near as progressive as the Kurds of Rojava. In fact, reactionary elements closed the border between themselves and the territory of the Kurds in Syria. Well, now, why would these Kurdish brothers and sisters in Iraq do that? It's because they feared the social content of the Kurdish movement in Syria, because it had that progressive nature, because it had that left image, the councils, the militias, etc. Whereas the leaders of the Kurds in Iraq, the official leaders, the bourgeois leaders, were simply profiting from the situation for their own benefit. And the leaders of the Kurds in Rojava, they also have a responsibility in limiting their aims within, let's say, the Kurdish territory. The irony is this: in the past, they were oppressed by the Assad regime. They de facto ended up in an alliance because of the rise of ISIS, etc. And then they appealed to the West, and then they allied with what's his name? The Americans. Sorry. Once you do that, you've given up your genuine self-determination to an imperialist power, and the imperialists have used they've used the Kurdish people for their interests in a particular moment, and when it no longer suits them, they betray them, like they're doing now. A section of the Kurdish people are being pushed out of their territory. If the Kurds had been the bearers of, let's say, the program of the Bolsheviks, and had been seen as the revolutionary communists in the region, now the Americans would not have had any interest, obviously, in forming an alliance with them. They would have done everything to fight them and destroy them. But that would have undermined, for instance, the bourgeois leadership of the Kurds in Iraq. They should have had a perspective of consciously directing their policies to undermine that bourgeois leadership and win over. And there was massive sympathy amongst the Kurds, especially the young Kurds in Iraq, for the Kurds of Syria. Yes. And they could have been, as you say, the bearers of an alternative program, which would have been, expropriate the bourgeois and fight for genuine socialist Syria and beyond the socialist federation. As you can see, sometimes you have to go against the stream. Sometimes you have to stick to your positions in a very difficult situation. Yes. But the mirror image, as you said, HTS is the force that the Turks have used to bring down a rotten regime. A revolutionary Kurdistan or Rojava could have been the basis for imagine an advancing Kurdish militia with a program to expropriate these rotten bourgeois who had taken over in Syria. That would have had a huge appeal across the whole of Syria. The regime
whole could rest of the region.
Yes, the regime could have collapsed, but not into the hands of these people, but into the hands of the workers and peasants of Syria. Now, there's no time to go into it here. There's also a theoretical discussion to be had about the council system that the Rojava Kurds had adopted.
Because the economic conditions are the same. Obviously, they are under enormous pressures. and you can't blame everything on the mistakes of the leadership. However, the way to get out of those conditions are via a planned economy and
Yes.
a massive industrialization, which is something you can do by expanding that revolution into more industrial countries such as Turkey or Western Syria,
Yes.
and using that technology and the know-how and so on, the industries there, to develop the
Yeah.
areas that you have
What
in Syria.
see what this highlights is an idea which can seem abstract to some people, that the answer to the solutions of the people in this region is a socialist federation of the Middle East. The Kurds, if they had adopted such an outlook and had a more internationalist approach, they could have been the bearers of that idea, taking the ideas of socialism, revolution into Turkey, into Syria, into Iran. And the conditions on the ground exist for such an idea to become popular. Now,
Yes.
we have always defended the rights of the Kurdish people to, to self-determination if they so wish, and to nationhood. But look at it. So long as Turkey is what it is, so long as Turkey is what it is, so long as Iran is what it is, so long as basically you have bourgeois
Capitalism.
ruling class and capitalism in power, they will play with this people or that people. Sometimes they will bend and pretend they defend their rights, use them to achieve their aims in a certain, and then betray them later on. This has happened over and over again. It's time to say what needs to be said. We cannot trust the imperialists. We cannot trust the individual bourgeois ruling classes of each of these countries. And it's the working class that has to step forward and take on its role in transforming society.
Yeah.
That is what is
The only
necessary.
real allies of the Kurdish people are the poor and oppressed workers, peasants, and youth of the Middle East and the rest of the world. And they have that support. They have the
That's right.
support
They
around
do.
the
They
world,
do.
everywhere. Okay, Fred, I
Just
think we
one,
need to. Yeah,
just the
go
last
ahead.
thing. It is absolutely disgusting what they're doing to the PKK and its supporters,
Yeah.
even outside of that area, declaring them terrorists, arresting them, oppressing the Kurds
Yeah,
in a moment which is for their convenience,
of course.
and declaring other people who were terrorists as rebels. The whole hypocrisy of the thing stinks to high heaven.
And it shows that the Western imperialism, for all the talk about the West being better, more modern, more civilized, is actually the most barbaric force and the supporter of the most barbaric forces around
They
the
are
world.
directly responsible for all of this. This is a
Yes, of course.
consequence of imperialist meddling in the affairs of other peoples.
Of course. Now, to continue, you spoke about the idea of saying something and going against the stream, even when it's not immediately visible to the vast majority. And I think Ukraine has been a very good example of that, to put it mildly.
Yes.
Now, I put this on the agenda of a discussion today because there was a very interesting article in the magazine called the Prospect, I think, and it's called "The Deepening Unpopularity of Zelensky." Now, here you have Zelensky, who's been carried up, put on a pedestal, paraded all over the world, used to win over the masses, in particular in the West, to support this war, this so-called just war against the authoritarian Russians and so on and so forth. And we said right at the beginning that everything that the West has said about Ukraine is a lie. Everything they said was a lie. And I think this article is a great admission of that. We were told that Ukraine was fighting a war for civilization, against authoritarianism, against reaction, against Putin, who is just like Hitler. I was listening to a interview with Boris Johnson this morning. It's from a few days ago. And they're asking, so do you think do you think Putin is more like Stalin or like Hitler? And Boris said, oh, he's more like Hitler. He's more like Hitler. Never mind all the people that these guys are getting killed in the Middle East and all the civilizations that are destroying one after another. However, it is quite disgusting to watch them, how they are dumping Zelensky now that they've used him. like a little monkey. He's like a little monkey for them. They promised him. He didn't want to have this war, by the way. The West was pushing for it. The West was pushing for it. Boris Johnson was one of the ones who was pushing for it. But I'll get to that. This article, I think, is damning indictment of this situation. And basically, it starts by admitting that the Zelensky and his whole regime has completely lost the support of the population in Ukraine. It says that recent polls suggest that just 22% of Ukrainians would vote to re-elect Zelensky for a second term, with just 16% marking him as their first choice. 16%. In fact, 60% of the population say that he shouldn't even be standing. Then you have the most popular people besides that. One of them is Zaluzhny, the old chief of staff. But he's an ambassador in London now. He's a British ambassador, Ukraine's ambassador to London. He has 42% support. Then there's Kirill Budanov, who is the head of the intelligence agency. He's got 18% support. Now, these are the most popular people in Ukraine. That is a very, very bad sign for a regime that its top people have such low support in a very extreme war situation, right? Then they go on to say, to admit, this is something I never hear in the Western press. They say that formally Zelensky's 5-year presidential term ended on 20th of May this year. His term ended. This is supposed to be a bourgeois democracy. In practice, though, there will be no campaigning or voting while the war still rages. In the meantime, Zelensky and his team will continue ruling directly through wartime powers that bypass parliament and, crucially, suspend all non-state broadcast media. This is what you have. You have a situation where a regime that has lost support and the trust of the population is concentrated all powers in its own hands, and is striking down against any critical voice, right? You just stop me when you want to comment, because I feel like this we could almost publish this whole article on our website, because it says everything that we've been saying. This was supposed to be a fledgling democracy where everyone, as opposed to the Russian dictatorship, right? And he goes on, he says, sorry?
Yeah, go on.
Then he goes on to say, despite reporting restrictions, a steady drip of shocking stories about corruption has fueled anger amongst voters, with 70% convinced the government is profiteering from the war. Again, we said this right from the beginning. All this money that's going into Ukraine, a huge chunk of it is never seeing the front line or putting arms in the hands of the soldiers. Independent online journalists from the likes of, and then it goes on to name some, says, have revealed local medical officials making millions from issuing fake medical certificates for draft dodgers, lucrative government procurement contracts going to cronies of senior ministers, and much more. Last year, the defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, was eventually fired 6 months after revelations of massive overpayments for food and equipment for the army. They were getting some of the most expensive potatoes in the world, I'll tell you that. Must have tasted really good. Last month, the head of an agency tasked with building British-designed bunkers, this is Britain being directly implicated, for Ukrainian electricity substations that would protect them from the Russian attack, resigned. He accused members of Zelensky's government of deliberately blocking the release of funds and demanding kickbacks. This is a country under severe attack. Their electric grid, more than any. They're trying to build defenses, and they can't. And this is what you've seen throughout, that all of the defenses and the trenches they're trying to build, a large part of them were never finished. You had, when the Russians went into Kharkov from the north earlier this year, they found that a lot of the constructions which were supposed to block Russian tanks from going in was just thrown on the side of the road. So the Russians were just...
there's a certain... It's not the same, but there are certain similarities here with what we just discussed in Syria.
Yeah.
If you want to have the long historical view, the old state-controlled planned economy, although it was bureaucratic and inefficient because of that, there wasn't genuine workers' control. That's been dismantled. And who's benefited from it are oligarchs, capitalists. Some of them, sometimes, ex-bureaucrats who profiteer from the situation, and they take over, and they enrich themselves personally. What goes with this is very often extreme forms of corruption. We have that in the Ukraine. But you see, the truth eventually emerges. Truth has this stubborn characteristic of being difficult to destroy and bury. It eventually emerges. And the effects of war also have a radicalizing effect. But you see, I can remember not so long ago, if you told the truth about what was going on, you'd be accused of being a Putin supporter. If you explain that this is not a war for democracy, but it's a war for the interests of particularly US imperialism in its global conflict with Russia, and that conflict exists around the world, you'd be accused of being a Putinist, because you try to tell the truth. Exactly. And in effect, we had to go against the stream when it came to the mainstream media version of what was going on. Because, look, it's clear Biden and the US pushed for this war as a way. Their idea was, this way we can bleed Russia dry, weaken it, because it has become a global player. I mean, I was in France a couple of weeks ago, and the news arrived that Chad and Senegal have just told the French where the door is. You can leave. They don't want them there. Who's coming in? It's the Russians and Chinese money as well. So that influence is growing. So there is a conflict between, the big power, America, and the rising powers like Russia, China, and others, for spheres of influence. And the Ukraine is one of them. It was at the heart of this. Now, they forced through this war. At the beginning, when Putin amassed his troops on the border, let's remember, he wasn't demanding a chunk of Ukrainian territory. He was demanding, one of his demands was the two Donbas republics to be autonomous within the Ukrainian Federation, and Russian language, and no NATO, i.e., that deal could have been made. Now, the right-wing nationalists will say, "Oh, that's abandoning our sovereignty, and we have the right to decide what." Well, the thing is, it's not they didn't decide; it's the Americans that decided the fate of the Ukrainian people at the cost.
No, in fact, at the cost of destroying the country. The GDP is down 30%. The whole country is destroyed.
Millions have emigrated.
Millions have emigrated. Actually, they say that 150,000 people who have been displaced from the east, supposedly they hate Russia, they would never have anything to do with Russia, they've gone back. Gone back to Russia and gone back to the places they used to live under Russian protected territories. Why? Because the government wasn't paying them and taking care of them. They were internally displaced. 1/3 of Mariupol, which was completely destroyed, is back now. These were people who left to Ukraine and then come back in Russian-controlled territory. But I actually wanted to just point to, because this article is making the same point as you, because what you are saying and what we said from the beginning, as you say, the truth has a way of coming out, and Marxism is foresight over astonishment, you can say, looking at the real underlying state of things. We come to conclusions that reality and real life will make abundantly clear in the long run. And this is what they say. This says one thing is in no doubt. As soon as an election date is announced, there will be no shortage of blame to go around. Many nationalist-minded Ukrainians will blame Zelensky for any compromise with Vladimir Putin. That might be so. They will want to fight on. Conversely, however, other Ukrainians will blame Zelensky for not compromising with the Kremlin at the very beginning of the war. they will blame the West for supposedly, no, not supposedly, in real life, really forcing Ukraine to fight instead of taking a deal. And then they go on to explain that there was a deal, that the Russians, before the war, there was a deal. In fact, Zelensky was elected on the basis of accepting that deal, on entering negotiations. And after the war, there was a deal. And they actually bring it here. They say, we forced them to reject this. And people are actually beginning to blame the West. This is a very dramatic shift in public opinion, which will have deep effects, because at a certain point, when you have 16% of the population supporting the president in wartime, what does that say? What does that means?
Yes.
That there's a time limit to the amount of time that this person can stay in place, or that the regime can rule without making important, significant changes at least. If not, maybe even lose everything. A lot of people are saying, well, what's the difference between you and the Russians? Let them take it and let's have peace. A lot of people would say that.
Look, any ordinary working class family desires to live in peace, to have a home, to have a job, to have enough wages to feed their kids, to have a reasonable life, and to live in peace. That is the main desire. There are moments when working people will support wars, when they see a justification for the war, when they see it as the only way of defending their interests if they have to. But generally speaking, people also like to go back to the home they had,
Yes,
the town they were brought up in, the country they feel is theirs. The people of Mariupol, probably most of them will want to go back eventually.
yeah,
And the same of other areas, especially when you consider that the regime in the Ukraine is extremely corrupt. The democracy, well, they should be voting, but they're not. They got a government which they have no power over to change, and yet opinion polls show that it has a very slim base now in society. When all the stories come out, and the people know the corruption that's going on, when you have a regime which has to hunt young men, when you have young men in the Ukraine who won't go out of their houses unless absolutely necessary, fear going to a cafe or a restaurant or a supermarket for fear of being grabbed by these people. What kind of an army is that has soldiers who are literally physically captured and sent to the front?
exactly.
Facing
They
what
don't
is
wanna
most likely a death sentence for a regime that you have lost all confidence in. This is the situation that's being created.
Yes,
All this will eventually come through, and the people will realize, you see, the Marxists, the revolutionary communists, can be attacked early on for, you have no interest in the Ukraine. It's not true. We actually defended the interests of the Ukrainian people with our ideas and policies.
yes.
We warned the imperialists, like the Americans, are using you for their purposes. They're not fighting for the rights of the Ukraine. And look at it now. Now that it's become evident that they cannot push Russia out of the territory that it's occupied, they're saying, well, we have to make a deal. Very nice. Yes, make a deal over the blood of tens of thousands of Ukrainian people, over the death and destruction which has been inflicted on this people. That's what the imperialists have done. And their supporters in the West who go on about democracy and the Ukraine, this and that and the other. Where's the democracy in the Ukraine? Where's the democratic regime?
Yeah.
You see, once this war is over, and it will be at some point, the people governing Ukraine will find suddenly that the people don't want them. Listen, the British people in 1945, when they had the first chance to vote, kicked Churchill out.
Yeah.
Churchill was the great war leader. He himself was shocked that the people did not support him. But working class people, they could see what was really going on.
I'm not sure Zelensky will be shocked. I think
because
that's why he's not calling elections.
No, because the defeat of Zelensky will be far bigger and deeper than even what Churchill faced at that time.
Exactly. Okay. We'll get back to this. Obviously, we've dealt with Ukraine many times, and we'll do so again next week. I can tell you because we have already recorded next week's episode, which is when most of us are on holiday. which will be a very good episode, by the way. But I'll get back to that in a minute. But for our last segment, I think we need to comment on the assassination of Brian Thompson, allegedly by Luigi Mangione. Luigi Mangione is a young American man who's been arrested on these charges. And we haven't commented on this. We've published 2 very good articles on our website on Marxist.com. You can read them by Mark Rahman, one of them, and the other one by Comrade John Peterson in the US. But this assassination has really brought, I spoke to an American comrade who was at our branch meeting 2 days ago, and he said he's never seen the level of unity in the US. And at first I didn't understand what he meant. But what he meant was how the enormous class anger in all parts of society has surfaced. This wave of sympathy with Luigi Mangione and celebration of the killing of this CEO, to the horror of the liberals. I mean, you have one after another, all of them come horrified, saying, "Oh, how can you celebrate? How can you celebrate the death or killing of another person?" And yet, of course, they do celebrate the profits of all of these companies every day or every year, and they do celebrate how much money is made, essentially by denying and limiting the access of people to healthcare, and how exorbitant charges are put on people. And I mean, it's just been an absolutely disgusting thing to look at, but also it's brought out class contradictions in society and class anger on an unheard of level. I know you brought some figures that I thought maybe you can read out for our listeners.
Well, America, the United States of America, the most powerful imperialist country in the world, immensely wealthy country, huge wealth accumulated in this country. And yet it's the country where ordinary working class people can literally face losing their home, being declared bankrupt because of their healthcare bills. I was looking at something, listen, 20 years ago, this is not a new thing. A professor at a university, they did a study, and this is what this article says about him. It says, he said that the implications of her findings, are that if such families are denied the ability to wipe out debts in bankruptcy, some will lose their homes, and many of these people will face collection for the rest of their lives. It's absurd. You have people, this is not about people who don't have healthcare insurance. This is about people who have it. The overwhelming majority of Americans do have some kind of private insurance. Otherwise, you're risking big time. When you have a situation where your healthcare depends on the executive or the bosses of a healthcare insurance company, that very often say that your application for the compensation, the reimbursement for the costs of your operation or whatever it is unjustified, and they say no. The latest thing is in America, the anesthetic. Who pays for the anesthetic? Do you know they've reached a point to say if you need extra anesthetic, that extra you got to pay yourself, even if you're insured. That means some poor individual in a situation of being operated on has to deal with these questions, while the people at the top are making huge money.
Just to interrupt you, I mean, while you continue, but when Benjamin Netanyahu was put on trial, was indicted for human rights abuses, one of the charges against him was limiting the access to anesthetics. I'm just saying that in the US, this is being done on a systematic basis by these companies.
Yes, I've got a printout of the draft of the next issue of the Comrades paper in America. This is the front page as it was being prepared, and obviously the main headline is on this question. But see, this is a company. The particular company involved, United Healthcare, is the company that denies the most, denying 32% of all claims. 1/3. Imagine paying insurance for something so important as your health, and then you get denied the compensation. They're receiving huge bills. People can't afford this, and it literally is killing huge numbers of people. The healthcare insurance companies kill people. That is the fact. They don't stab people directly, and they don't shoot them directly. But this is the real situation. And in the same time, they've made billions of profits out of this. This is a hugely radicalizing event for the United States, affecting millions of people. I tell you, the sense I got, I was in the United States recently, the sense I got is a lot of people were hoping the guy would never get caught. I'm telling you.
In fact, the police had a hard time finding him because people were trying to help him.
The comments were, somebody must have seen him. They're just not reporting him. And then eventually, obviously, somebody will. But look, what's interesting is the way the right wing tried to exploit this. They tried to make out that the people who are happy, glad, whatever, at the killing of this CEO are the left, the far left, this kind of thing. Ben Shapiro, famous right wing, so-called, I don't know if you want to call him an influencer or whatever you call him, but he famous on social media. He published a little thing called The Evil Revolutionary Left Cheers Murder, trying to make out that it's only the left, you see, the nasty left, whereas the reasonable people, they support what this insurance company was doing. Well, it's interesting to see some of the comments. The companies are publishing them. One of them says, "I'm not buying this left versus right shit anymore, Ben. I want healthcare for my family." Another one, "Sorry, Ben. Lifelong conservative." That's it. The person writing says, "I'm a lifelong conservative and don't have any ounce of sympathy for this CEO. How many Americans have died because of his company's greed? Healthcare shouldn't be a choice between living and permanently being in crippling debt." Another one, "This isn't a left versus right issue. It's the working class versus the wealthy. And that's probably why you're trying to pretend it's something that it's not." These are the kind of comments. And then there's all the concerned headlines of the bourgeois media. Because what this has done, far more than any opinion poll that you could carry out, it's shown how millions and millions of Americans are suffering the consequences of the crisis of the capitalist system we're living under. And in particular, this question of healthcare, this is the life and death issue for many people. There are many people who know a relative who has suffered because of this or has died because of this. And therefore, this really brought into focus this class divide of American society.
I think there's a very interesting article in the New Statesman. It's called "Why the Assassination of Brian Thompson Ignited American Politics." There's lots of very interesting things. We don't have time to go into all the good parts, but there's one point that he makes is that he said that life expectancy. He says Thompson's life expectancy as a member of the top 1% was 88 years, or 15 years longer than the life expectancy of the average American male. And I thought, and afterward, he says one tweet alleged that Brian Thompson made his money by denying people care and pricing them to death. And then they added, "What goes around comes around." Now, I actually wanted to talk about this question of violence because that's been one of the things, the liberals, you cannot talk about violence, you cannot do any violent acts of violence. This guy was not doing acts of violence. And you see, there is violence and violence. One of our listeners actually sent me a very interesting quote by Frederick Engels, and I thought was very fitting. He says, "When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, such that death results, we call the deed manslaughter. When the assailant knew in advance that the injury would be fatal, we call this deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by a sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessaries of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is inevitable, which is the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish and yet permits these conditions to remain, its deed is murder just as surely as the deed of the single individual, disguised malicious murder, murder against which none can defend himself, which does not seem what it is, because no man sees the murderer, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than of commission. But murder it remains. As Frederick Engels, The Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1845. And I think we've been saying this very often. It's not violence, is not just pulling a trigger and putting a bullet, although the ruling class does plenty of that, bombs and bullets and outright bloody bloodbaths. But it's the everyday violence of unemployment, which limits people's access to healthy lives, which stresses them, which puts them in unbearable conditions, running after the necessities of life, pollutes the air that they breathe, pollutes the food that they eat in every single way. Poverty, misery, exploitation at work, overexploitation, increase. All of this is violence, and it's a system that's maintained by the sword, by the bullet, by the armed forces of men of the state, maintaining the system everywhere. People say you can just check out. You can't check out of the system. You can't stay outside of capitalism. If you don't stay within capitalism and don't work as a worker within capitalism, you will die. So it's under the threat of death that you are given, how do you say, a more protracted, but nevertheless violent death. And I think this is something that Americans feel. Of course, healthcare and this particular company is an outstanding representative of this of the ruling class in this regards. But it wakes the same anger that exists everywhere in society about everything that the status quo has to offer. It feels as violence. It feels as oppression. And I just wanted to end. I mean, you can obviously also have that you will have the final word, but there's just one quote at the end of this article. There's lots of good quotes, but there's one quote. He talks about oligarchs and that the word oligarch has become quite popular in the US recently. He says, the word oligarch seems to have been cropping up more frequently in the US lately in contests like this, and it points both to the long history of such power imbalances and to a more constructive, less bloody way of responding to complaints of bad treatment. It is redolent of the reaction against the concentrations of power in the Gilded Age of the 19th century. That's the start of the industrialization in the US. Meanwhile, it's becoming increasingly common to refer to present-day America as undergoing a second Gilded Age. This was a time of extreme class struggle. And there are signs of a similar reaction. This is the interesting bit that you mentioned about right and left, and Trump and the conservatives and so on. It says, the ideological tangle of the impending Trump administration contains a strand that speaks to all this with its promise to break up big tech and make America healthy again, even as Trump's ally Elon Musk seems eager to gut Medicare. We will have to wait and see which tendency wins out. Nothing can justify the shooting of a person dead in the street, but whatever the motive turns out to have been, the reaction suggests that some of Americans' aggressive populist anger might be directed at the existing model of healthcare. I.e., there's a class anger against the oligarchy, against the rich, against the ultra-rich, and that this is being partially expressed through Trump. And we've been saying this, that Trump appeals to the working class, has appealed to the sentiment, in fact, which is why he could win. Otherwise, he couldn't win without that layer of the workers supporting him. But also that he has two strands that he's based himself on. One is the working class who want what they want, who want their basic necessities to be met, as the system is not. And the other strand that he's basing himself on is billionaires, people like Elon Musk and himself, obviously, the ruling class, which is the enemy of the workers. And that this is the contradiction which is going to be defining the next period.
Yes, yes. You see, when I was there, you could see the real concern of the US ruling class. Not just the US, by the way. I would say ruling classes around the world, but the United States obviously is at the center of this. What this revealed was the real class hatred that exists inside US society, the real class divide. Now, politically, that can express itself in confused ways, such as the Trump vote. But nonetheless, a big section of the working class voted like the people I was quoting earlier on. Some of these people are on the right, but they say it's not a left-right, it's a class question. There's a bit of confusion there, obviously. If it's a class question, which side of the political spectrum do you stand on? Now, we can make that point, obviously, as an organization. But you see, this young guy that acted, I mean, allegedly they say, but he hasn't not admitted it. He even had a manifesto in which he attacked these oligarchs, in effect. Looking at that young guy, he comes from a well-to-do family. He was the best student at his school and got an Ivy League university, and he came from a well-to-do background, but he clearly radicalized by what he was seeing around him. We were commenting amongst the comrades. It was like a bit like those Narodniks who they were sort of like, petty bourgeois, middle class layers, radicalized by what they saw, and sought to take action. Now here, this guy took an individual act, which has highlighted things, yes, but it hasn't solved anything. I actually said in America, the one conclusion that these executives will draw from all this is that all those billions of profits they make, some of them should be spent in increasing their personal security, because they are not going to draw the conclusion, oh, just a minute, maybe we should spend a bit more on helping people with their healthcare. They're not going to do that. But this individual act, you see, it did remind me a little bit, talk about the killing of people. It reminded me a little bit, when I was a young man, my father died. When he died, the doctors asked me, did your father ever work with metals? You can't imagine the rage that built up inside me when they asked me that question. He was a steel worker. He worked all his life with metals, and it produced his early death. I remember the executive of the company he worked for at the time. He appeared on television in a chat show. I was watching it with absolute hatred and rage, listening to him. This is what I thought as a young man. You killed my father, right? Now, of course, I couldn't go into a court case and claim that with the law. But that's the conclusion I drew. You guys are killing workers every day, right? But the question, I was fortunate that I met the Marxists and understood that the road is not individual acts like this act of Mangione. That energy should be channeled elsewhere, into building a party that brings together the workers, the youth, all this anger, this class anger which is out there, should be brought together into a force that can change society. This is not about, vengeance over one individual profiteer from a, health insurance company. This is about removing the bourgeois class as a class from power, taking over the wealth which they control and using it for the benefit of all. There's no reason why somebody in America should die because of the lack of a payment for healthcare costs. It should be, of all the countries in the world, the contradiction of the US is they have some of the most advanced medicine, and at the same time, people who have no access to it. That's the nature of the system we live in. To put an end to this, we have to build a party that can explain all of this in the language that the working class can understand, offer them a program that solves this crisis, and that can only be a program which is based on nationalizing the big corporations. This insurance company should be expropriated, taken over, use all the billions they've made to actually guarantee free healthcare for all American people, and take over the big corporations and use that immense wealth for the benefit of working people, not just in America, by the way, but globally. You wouldn't have the mess in the Middle East if it wasn't for the meddling of the US imperialists. So the fight inside America, the fight in the Middle East, is the same fight. It's the fight of working people against the capitalist class that govern us. Their time, their end is coming. It must come. But we have to organize to make sure that it doesn't lead to a collapse of society, in effect, a collapse of the state with no real alternative, like in Syria, or a collapse of the regime, but a new society emerges from it, which is there, and the potential for that exists. But we have to channel it. That's what we're trying to do as an organization.
Thank you, Fred. I think that's a very, very fitting end. We've seen in this program that complete dead end of the system that drags humanity down the state of barbarism everywhere in different ways, nevertheless everywhere. We've seen the enormous dissatisfaction and anger that exists on the ground. This example of the Luigi Mangione has brought that out in the US. It's shown us the anger, but it hasn't solved it. It hasn't solved the solution to what should we do with this anger. And as you said, we need to build a revolutionary organization. The Revolutionary Communist International is such an organization working in 70 plus countries all around the world. If you're interested, write to us on marxist.com, join us. I think the link will be in the description and in the chats in this program. And join the struggle for socialist revolution against capitalism, imperialism all over the world. Thank you very much. To all of our listeners, who are regular listeners, next week we will send a end of year episode, which we've already recorded with our sister podcast, The Spectre of Communism. It'll be an episode where we will kind of go back and look at all of the main events of the past year with myself and Jorge, who's also been a guest regularly on this show. And after that, we will be on holiday for 1 week before we'll come back on the 2nd of January with Comrade Alan Woods as the first episode of the new year. Thank you very much, Fred, and thank you to everyone out there. We will see you next week.